Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO. In this year of unprecedented uncertainty for small nonprofits like ours, you can make a direct impact on the future of our organization. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, our mission is to foster civic engagement and build programs that bring people together from around the world around the most compelling issues. This diversity of views presented by experts and leaders in their field is needed today more than ever before. With your generous support, we will be able to continue to serve you and our global community. So please stay with us at the end of the program for just a minute to find out how you can continue to support us. We thank all of you who are giving so generously to keep us going. Thank you so much. It is now my great pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan, you've got 3 terrific topics for us today. I can't wait. So I get so excited reading them off because I get to anticipate all of this great discussion. The first is down to the wire, will Congress pass a COVID relief bill? Second, Georgia's 2 Senate elections, the highest stakes possible. And third, Biden and Europe putting the pieces back together. I know so many of you want to ask Dan questions. Most of you know the drill. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica will get to them in about 25 minutes during the Q&A portion. So Dan, here we go. Fingers crossed.
Kim, thank you so much. And as you might guess, and as all of you might guess, the biggest challenge this week, like many weeks, is figuring out which of the 3 topics to talk about, because which 3 topics to talk about, because there is so much going on in state, national, and international news. Normally in December by this point, things start to slow down a little bit, but that certainly hasn't been the case in 2020. It's been an extraordinary year ever since we started doing these programs back in March. And so it shouldn't be surprising that it continues to be extraordinary. And we have, as Kim mentioned, selected 3 topics for this week. But of course, we'll be happy to talk about anything you like to in the second portion of the program when Jessica joins me and we begin to go through your questions. But the 3 we'll talk about are, number 1, the fierce debate in Washington, the re-energized debate in Washington over COVID relief legislation. Number 2, last week we got a number of questions from many of you about the 2 Georgia runoff Senate races taking place on January 5th to determine control of the US Senate during President Biden's first 2 years in office. And third, as we continue on our conversation about the new administration and foreign policy, last week we talked about Joe Biden in China. And this week, we'll talk about Joe Biden in Europe. And I know many of you had also suggested that at some point we examine the Biden administration's likely approach to the Middle East. And rest assured that that's a topic we will talk about next week in our final webinar of the year before everyone enjoys a well-deserved rest until we come back again in early 2021. So let's talk about the COVID relief legislation. Now, last week, I had told all of you that the absolute drop-dead deadline was December 11th, which is tomorrow. 1, because that would be the deadline for passing a bill to keep the government funded, but also, as the House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer pointed out, for those members of Congress who wanted to spend Christmas with their families, December 11th would be the last day they could meet in Washington, fulfill a 14-day quarantine, and be completed with that quarantine by Christmas Day. So that December 11th deadline looks fairly certain, but I have to admit by this point in my life, I should know better that no deadlines in Washington, D.C. are certain. And of course, that's exactly what's happened here. It looks now like COVID will take precedence over Christmas for many members of Congress, because the House of Representatives yesterday passed a 1-week extension on the government funding bill, the bill that literally keeps the government functioning. And that deadline is now December 18th, a week from tomorrow. So they have until next Friday in all likelihood. But just this morning, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi mentioned that December 26th, the day after Christmas, is the day that unemployment benefits expire for many unemployed Americans. And so perhaps that is the real deadline. The honest truth is, we don't know. The only thing that's certain is that for any number of reasons, a growing number of senators and congressmen on both sides of the aisle are feeling the heat here. And given the resurgence of the coronavirus around the country, the idea of going home empty-handed is something that's not acceptable to them. There's still big differences, most notably, as we talked about last week, on the key questions of liability protections, protections against lawsuits for businesses, for schools, and for hospitals, and the amount of state aid to state and local government that would be provided. And over the last few days, there's a new fight that's erupted between the White House and members of Congress of both parties. Is the new White House proposal, as forwarded by Secretary Treasurer Steven Mnuchin, has suggested reducing the amount of ongoing unemployment benefits in order to give almost all Americans a one-time direct cash payment, as was the case in the original relief bill passed earlier this year. So they are making progress, but it seems to be happening at glacier-like speed. And there's not a lot of time left in the year. But for all these differences, there does still seem to be a real intent among the congressional leaders in both parties to get something done. So a little bit more on this in just a minute. But before we go any further, I'd like to get your prospects. Since I was so certain about the deadline last week, and I'm no longer as certain, what do you think? When will Congress pass a COVID relief bill? Will it be before the end of the year, before New Year's Eve? Will it be after the new year, but before January 20th, when Joe Biden is sworn into office? Will it take place after January 20th, once Biden has assumed his responsibilities? Or will they simply not pass? Will they simply not pass a new COVID relief bill? As a reminder, we asked a slightly different question of all of you last week. And last week, 40% of you said that you believed that a bill would be passed before the end of the year, albeit with a slightly different framed question. Let's see what you think now, given the new circumstances. Claire, what do we got? Well, you're more optimistic. You're much more optimistic this week than you were last week. We're now up to 64% saying that in the next 3 weeks, there will be some type of COVID relief bill passed. Another 15%, that's almost 80% total, say that it'll be done after the first of the year, but before Biden takes office. Another 18% say it won't happen until Biden has become president, and 4% of you skeptics say it's not going to happen under any circumstances whatsoever. So the key movers here, as we talked about last week, is the so-called Gang of Nine. These are 9 senators, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 1 independent, who've been working on a compromise bill all the way through. And what I will tell you, just to take a minute, is to offer some historical perspective. This gang language in national politics in Congress is nothing new. In fact, Washington, D.C. might be the only big city in the country that likes gangs, because this latest gathering of 9 is the latest in a long line of bipartisan efforts to try to find compromise when the two parties' leaders can't. Way back in 1983, there was a bipartisan gang that came together that ultimately helped Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan save Social Security. In the early 1990s, there was a gang of 7 that started to tackle corruption in Congress. In 2009 was a big year for gangs. There was a gang of 6 that laid the groundwork for the Affordable Care Act. There was a gang of 8 that was in charge of implementing deficit reduction recommendations, and a gang of 10 that worked on overhauling energy policy. In 2013, there was another gang of 8. This one took on immigration policy. And perhaps the most successful bipartisan gang in Washington in modern history was in 2005, but it was a bipartisan group that kept something from happening rather than allowing it. For those of you with long memories, you may remember that back in 2005, there was a gang of 14, 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, who worked together to keep the supermajority threshold on ending debate on nominations be taken away. That's obviously happened since. And just as a historical note, that Gang of 14 that did succeed, at least then, in preventing the elimination of the supermajority for judicial and other nominations, that Gang of 14 included both Senator Susan Collins and Senator Lindsey Graham. So what goes around comes around in Washington, just like anywhere else. So now this year's gang, trying to break the logjam on COVID relief, released their latest summary yesterday on a potential compromise. And they still haven't figured out what to do about the protections against lawsuits. They still haven't decided how much to fund state and local government. But what was interesting is late yesterday, Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who is probably Joe Biden's closest ally in Congress, said that he and his other colleagues would release a proposal on lawsuit protection that would be a 6-month moratorium on all coronavirus-related lawsuits and would provide employers that are sued with a greater ability to defend themselves, even if the plaintiffs have evidence that their actions had caused some harm. So we don't have any way of knowing yet whether that's going to bridge the gap. But I'll offer you this, is that if Joe Biden's best friend in the Senate is offering a compromise on this critical issue, it's pretty clear that the president-elect still wants to see the bill happen. And he's still exerting pressure, at least on Democrats and perhaps on some Republicans, in a pretty big way. I'll be more than happy to talk about this later in the program if you like. But we do want to, but even though there's a lot of other interesting parts and a lot of other very relevant parts of these negotiations, I do want to cover our other two topics so that we can get on to your questions in just a little bit. So let's move on. Let's move on to talking about those Georgia runoffs. 2 campaigns for U.S. Senate in Georgia, as we've talked about before, because of the rules in that state. In order to get elected to the Senate, it's not just enough to get more votes than any of the other candidates. You have to get more than 50%. And because Georgia had not just a regularly scheduled election for 2020, in which incumbent Republican David Perdue was seeking his next term, but because another senator retired last year, and Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia, a Republican, appointed a woman, a successful business executive by the name of Kelly Loeffler, to fill that seat, we have 2 runoff elections taking place in a little bit less than a month. So what do we know? What do we know about this runoff, these runoffs taking place in Georgia? We know that Georgia, for many, many years, was a very safe state for Republicans, a deep red state. But in recent years, it's become much more purple. And Donald Trump won Georgia 4 years ago by a much smaller margin than Mitt Romney or John McCain or George Bush had in their elections. In 2018, the Democratic nominee Stacey Abrams lost the state by the slimmest of margins. And of course, just last month, as all of you know, Joe Biden became the first Democratic presidential candidate since 1992 to carry the state. So Georgia is decidedly purple. And before I go any further on my own thoughts, we'd love to hear yours. What do you think, having read and been thinking about and following this election? What do you think the most likely outcome is? Will Republicans win both seats and therefore maintain the Republican majority in the Senate? Will Democrats, both John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, win their respective elections, creating a 50-50 tie and a de facto Democratic majority, with Vice President Kamala Harris casting deciding votes on many occasions? Or will they split, the Democrat winning one, Republican winning the other? What do all of you think? Wow. All right, let's see what we got here. 20% think both Republican candidates will win. Only a slightly larger margin, 26%, just over 1/4, think that both Democrats will win. And over half think it'll be a split decision. And we didn't break down between which Republican and which Democrat, because we'll have plenty of time to talk about that before or after the election. But it is notable that only 1/4 of our group thinks that the Democrats will maintain control of the Senate, or will achieve control of the Senate come January, making President Joe Biden's challenges on Capitol Hill much greater than they would be if the Democrats were able to win both. Right now, the polls are showing that in the regularly scheduled race, that Perdue, the incumbent, and John Ossoff, the challenger, are basically tied. And in the other election, though, Raphael Warnock has opened up what seems to be not a safe, but a mid to high single-digit lead over Kelly Loeffler. So it looks like Democrats have an advantage in one of those two races. The other one looks a little bit too close to call. And I know what most of you are thinking. You're thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just finish criticizing the polls for being off in so many states in November? So why are we already relying on them for a January election? And what I will tell you, while I can't vouch for these polls, I will say that while public opinion polling was way off in many states, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and in Iowa, in Georgia, the polls were pretty close. And so that doesn't mean the same thing will occur in January, but it should give you at least some encouragement. Right now, the Democratic candidates themselves, the two campaigns, have raised more money for their races than the Republican incumbents. But when it comes to outside spending from independent and barely affiliated groups, the Republicans now do have an advantage. We'll see if that closes between now and Election Day. But early voting in Georgia starts in just about a week. So right now, that Republican advantage in terms of outside spending does loom large. In a lot of ways, it's a pretty typical debate on matters of public policy. The Democrats are talking about healthcare and about race relations and discrimination. Republicans are talking about crime and sometimes about socialism. But the meta issue, of course, is control of the Senate. And both sides, all four Senate candidates, are making it clear that the stakes involved here correctly go well beyond just the state of Georgia. Most Georgia Republicans are in a pretty difficult and pretty tricky position. They're arguing that this is a last stand to stop Democrats from controlling Washington, D.C. But of course, in order to believe that the Republican control of the Senate is the last stand for the GOP, that assumes that there's a Democratic president, which a lot of these same Republicans are not willing to say out loud. And because Donald Trump himself, as all of you know, is still challenging the results, many Republicans are worried that conservative voters in Georgia might not turn out because they believe that if the last election was fixed, that this next one will be too. And we've actually seen some of the president's allies calling for a boycott and telling conservatives and Republicans not to vote at all. Trump himself, when he went to Georgia this past weekend, said that the election was fixed, but that Georgia Republicans should vote anyway. And we'll find out whether that's a contradictory message going forward or whether it's something that his supporters are able to differentiate. Here's the bottom line in Georgia. Most elections, most normal elections, require two things in order for a campaign to succeed. A successful campaign has to, number one, motivate your most loyal supporters, but number two, reach out to persuade voters in the middle of the political spectrum, beyond the base, to support your candidate. Two separate goals accomplished in two very different ways. But in a runoff election, like most special elections, there really aren't any undecided voters because most of these people voted for one or both of these Senate candidates not too long ago. So runoff elections like these are completely about motivating your base, turning out your most loyal supporters. And so that's the question in the weeks ahead. Do the minority voters and suburban progressives in the greater Atlanta area turn out as much in January as they did in November? Or do older voters and voters in small town and rural communities become more motivated, either for Trump or to stop the Democratic takeover? Does Trump contesting the national outcome, does that inspire his supporters or does it confuse them? Or do the Democrats get motivated by the possibility of giving Biden a Senate majority and allowing him to move forward with most of his agenda? Trump, as I mentioned, was in Georgia this past Saturday, but ended up spending most of his time talking about his own election as opposed to about the Senate candidates. And Biden, for his part, it's just been announced, is going to Georgia on Tuesday. We'll see how that goes. Before we go on to our third topic, I'd like to ask you guys to weigh in again. What do you think about Trump and Biden's visits to the state? First question, thank you, Claire, is will Trump campaigning for the Republican candidates help or hurt the Republicans? In other words, will Loeffler and Perdue be helped by Trump being there, or will their prospects be damaged by the potential confusion that's caused? What do you think? Interesting, almost a split. 31%, a little bit less than a third, say that having Trump in the state will help their candidacies. 38%, a little bit more, say hurt. And 31%, about a third also, say no difference. And so, Claire, let's put up the flip side of this question, if we can, because Biden is going to Georgia on Tuesday to campaign for Warnock and for Ossoff. So what do you think about this? Will Biden campaigning for the Democratic candidates help them, or will it damage their election prospects come January? Let's see what the results on this one are when they come up. Oh, look at this, much clearer sentiment here. 83% believe that Biden's visit to Georgia helps the Democratic candidates. Only 2% think it'll hurt, and then a smaller 15% say no difference. So let's spend a few minutes talking about Biden in Europe, and then we will get to your questions. So it's pretty clear, as we discussed last week, that China represents the most significant and most sweeping foreign policy challenge for the new administration, but certainly not the only one. So let's talk about our traditional European allies and where that relationship is and where it might be headed. Now, most Western European leaders, frankly, they felt abandoned by Trump, and they were very relieved and are very excited by the prospect of a president in Joe Biden who views the US-Europe relationship in the post-World War II era through a more traditional lens. But it is, as you might suspect, it's a lot more complicated than that. So Trump, over his 4 years in office, almost relentlessly assaulted the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and he was particularly critical of Article 5 of NATO's charter. And Article 5 pledges that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on them all. And when Trump raised publicly questions about whether that was valid or not, it's not surprising that the other 29 countries in NATO became very, very nervous, because for years they have relied on a mutual defense relationship between their countries and the US to protect them from common enemies. And many European officials think that if Trump had been reelected, that would have spelled permanent doom for NATO. Now, Biden already has sent any number of very conciliatory messages. He has reaffirmed US leadership and commitment to NATO and to shared defense. He's announced plans to immediately rejoin the Paris Climate Accords and to rejoin the World Health Organization. But even with those steps, it's worth noting, it's important to note, that many European leaders have been coming to terms for some time now with the United States not being as powerful or as reliable an ally as it has been in the past. And even with a new president more committed to those relationships, what's happened is that 4 years of Trump attacks on European institutions have left a lot of allies wary of relying on US leadership and concerned that Trump's populist approach is going to remain a force, not just in their countries, but in ours. It's entirely possible in future elections, we could go back to a more isolationist or protectionist approach, as Trump has done. So 3 points in particular as it relates to the US and Europe that I want to talk about, and then we will move to your questions. But just to reemphasize that, European leaders know that Biden is much more committed to that relationship than Trump was, but they are a lot more wary now. And it's not just a matter of switching an on-off switch to get that relationship back to where it was, one, because of their concerns about the outcomes of the next elections, but also because some of these issues have gotten very tricky over the last 4 years. And while there are many potential points of contention between Europe and the US, there's 3 in particular I want to mention quickly. One, as I've already alluded to, is concerns about shared defense, particularly as it relates to Russia. The second is concerns about the rising presence of China, which we talked about last week. And third, concerns about trade, both US and Europe trade, trade between US and Europe, and global trade as well. All right, so let's start with Russia. Nobody was happier by Donald Trump's approach to this part of the world than Vladimir Putin. Putin's agenda in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe had challenged the rest. As NATO weakened, Putin began to insinuate Russian representatives into European politics, He started supporting Moscow-friendly candidates with money and was much more aggressive in the spread of disinformation in European elections than here. And of course, on matters relating to the US election and possible Russian interference, Trump did his best to avoid any type of criticism or confrontation. Now, of course, you should expect a much different approach from Joe Biden on this front, on human rights issues, on economic issues, but especially on defense. And I'm going to read you a quote from a speech that Biden gave early last year, which I promise you they've been reading in Moscow as well. This is the excerpt. Quote, "The Kremlin fears a strong NATO, the most effective political military alliance in modern history. We must impose real costs on Russia for its violations of international norms and stand with Russian civil society, which has bravely stood up time and time again against President Putin's kleptocratic authoritarian system," end quote. Kleptocratic authoritarian system, that is a much different approach from Joe Biden than from Donald Trump. And what Biden has pointed out is that in order to successfully confront Russia in the way that he described in that speech, it's not something the United States can do unilaterally. It is going to require a shared effort with allies in Europe and elsewhere. Now, there's an immediate challenge looming, and that's the expiration of the so-called New START agreement, which is now the only remaining arms control treaty between the US and Russia. And New START expires 2 weeks after Biden's inauguration. Biden, rather than trying to renegotiate the entire treaty in 2 weeks, has already begun sounding out a 5-year extension, which would give him and his administration some breathing room to deal with some of the problems that have worsened over the last 4 years. Problems like Russia's development of new strategic and ballistic weapons that haven't been covered in any arms deal, space-based weaponry, cyber aggression, and any number of issues as well. And on top of that, challenges in the Ukraine and other former Soviet republics, Russia's involvement in Syria and other places in the Middle East, as continued espionage and disinformation threats. In order to successfully confront Russia, Biden must rebuild your relationships with Europe, and quickly. We talked about China last week, but it's worth talking about in a European context for a minute as well, because Europe and the United States are no longer on the same page on China. So a couple things here. Before Barack Obama left office, President Obama began talking about a US pivot, not abandoning Europe, but focusing much more of its time and energy and attention on the Pacific Rim. And while many people in this country think of that as a very smart and appropriate strategic move, a lot of people in Europe felt a little bit abandoned by that. And many European leaders expect Biden to go back to that pivot and essentially to pick up where Obama left off. Now, when it comes to the China-America standoff that we talked about last week, Europe has pretty much decided not to take sides. There's pressure for them to, but they've made it clear that they're going to follow their own interests and values and trade relationships, and they're not going to side with one or the other. The EU is not considering sanctions on Beijing over Hong Kong. Germany is still pushing for an EU-China investment trade treaty. The United States has an ally in in China, in Europe, but that ally might not be as steadfast when it comes to China as it needs to be. Once again, it becomes critically important for Biden to rebuild and strengthen those relationships. So among other things, he can convince our European allies that working with them on a multilateral approach to China is something that's going to require support, not just from other Pacific Rim countries, but from Europe as well. And then last and finally, I want to talk for just a minute about trade. And I'm going to refer back to the interview that Joe Biden did with Tom Friedman in the New York Times that we discussed last week. Now, last week we talked about Biden's conversation with Friedman about China, but there was also some very telling language from the president-elect on economic trade policy. And I'm going to quote from Friedman. This is not Biden, but this is Friedman, to give you some context of what I'm talking about. Friedman said the following: "Part of generating more leverage, though, is developing bipartisan consensus at home for some good old American industrial policy. Massive government-led investments in America research and development, infrastructure, and education to better compete with China and not just complain about it. Both Democratic and Republican senators have drafted bills calling for such a strategy. So what Friedman is saying is that in order to have more effective trade policy, that it's going to require a revitalized American industrial policy and a much greater investment in research and development and in manufacturing. That's why industrial and manufacturing policy is so important for domestic politics. Not only does it give the US the leverage to engage in trade negotiations, not just with China, but with Europe and around the world. But the other reason the industrial manufacturing policy is so important is it gives Joe Biden cover in his own party. And when a president starts talking about expanding free trade, there are a lot of Democratic progressives, just like there are a lot of arch conservatives. And there's a lot of working class voters in those upper Midwestern states who are so important politically, who when they hear free trade, they hear that their jobs are at risk. So when Europe hears Biden, and so what Biden has to do is to continually reassure those working class voters that the expanded trade will expand manufacturing job opportunities, not contract them, as has been the case in the past. And so when Europe hears Biden talking about ramping up US manufacturing and promoting a more aggressive trade approach in the Pacific, it makes Europe nervous about their own trade tensions with China, with America. Biden has to reassure Europe that even though he's not going to be as confrontational as Trump, he's not going to roll over either. Anyway, the Europeans are happy to have Biden, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it definitely won't be easy. Lots for us to talk about on this front, as well as many others in the new year. So with that, Jessica, if you'd be willing to join me, and we'll use the rest of the time for our group's questions, which, as I've told you many times before, is by far my favorite part of our program.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. The first question, what is your assessment of the pending Texas lawsuit? When would the Supreme Court determine whether to hear the case?
Okay, so as all of you know, the state of Texas has filed a very unusual lawsuit in the US Supreme Court against 4 key swing states for violating voting procedures in a way that potentially impacted the outcome of the election. Every legal expert that I have read, Jessica, from the left to the right, says that the suit has absolutely no plausible chance of succeeding. There's many, many reasons for that, but the most important is that elections, very specifically according to the Constitution, are state-based entities. There's no such thing as a federal government-run election. And so one state doesn't have any say whatsoever in how another state conducts its elections. So the first challenge for the Supreme Court, should they even want to pick it up, which I don't think they do, is that Texas has no standing as a state other than the one in questions to challenge either the results or the procedure in the other state. It's fairly clear that the court wants to dispose of this fairly quickly. They asked for the 4 contested states to offer their response by today on a 24-hour turnaround, which is almost unheard of for the US Supreme Court. It's worth noting that when a Pennsylvania-based complaint reached the court a few days ago, the US Supreme Court dismissed the request immediately with no dissent whatsoever. So that doesn't mean that it was a 5-4 vote or a 6-3 vote. It means that there was not a single Supreme Court justice, not Amy Coney Barrett, not Clarence Thomas, not anyone, who said that they felt that the Supreme Court ought to even hear the Pennsylvania case, let alone decide in the plaintiff's favor. And while nothing is impossible, as we've learned over the last years, it seems highly, highly, highly unlikely that the US Supreme Court will see the Texas challenge any more favorably than they did the Pennsylvania one. It's also worth noting that technically speaking, as of Tuesday, the election is over. All 50 states have now, 49 of the 50 states, Wisconsin is hearing one last legal challenge. 49 of the 50 states have now certified the election results. And next week, on Monday, December 14th, the electors will be officially named. So even if there were 5 justices who thought Texas had standing, even if there were 5 justices who saw this lawsuit as much more credible than the Pennsylvania challenge, even so, it would require the US Supreme Court not just to interfere in what they saw as an undecided election, which was the case in 2000, not just to actively engage to overturn, to reverse election results, but they would actually have to undo legally approved election results in order to rule in the state of Texas's favor. Nothing's impossible, but at the risk of sounding arrogant, given my many, many wrong predictions, as much as I try to avoid making them, this one looks, if not completely impossible, pretty close to it. And the next day to watch, as we talked about last week, is January 6th, when Congress gathers to vote to ratify the election results. There are any number of Republican members of the House of Representatives who, like Democrats in 2001 and 2005 and 2017, have made it clear that they want to challenge the results. There's no indication yet that a Republican senator is going to join them. But even if one does, a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives and a balance of power in the Senate so closely divided means that January 6th could lead to one last round of drama and dudgeon, but once again, very unlikely to overturn the final election results.
Thank you. This next questioner combined the first and second topic. So is COVID relief legislation a key issue for the Georgia Senate runoff elections?
It's a great question. And the COVID relief has come up in the election. The 2 incumbents defending legislation that they voted for earlier this year to provide relief, the 2 Democratic challengers demanding that they support more. So it has been one of many issues under debate in the election, but it's not one that's overwhelming the campaign dialogue. Although it is worth noting that even with Donald Trump's visit last weekend and Joe Biden's coming up next week, even given the very large level of campaign activity in which both sides, all 4 Senate candidates, are now sending volunteers door to door, Georgia's involved in a resurgence of the virus, not all that different than California's. They're facing historically high caseloads at the time that this election is taking place, and it is possible that that could affect turnout on January 5th.
Thank you. If the Senate is 50-50, how is the majority leader selected?
The Senate majority leader is selected the way they always are, by a vote of the Senate. And because there would presumably be a 50-50 tie between Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell, Vice President Kamala Harris, as an ex officio member of the Senate, would cast the deciding vote, presumably in favor of Senator Charles Schumer. What's happened in the past is in one other circumstance in recent years in which we've seen a 50-50 split in the Senate. At that point, the Republican and Democratic leaders agreed to realign the committees and give both parties a certain number of committee chairmanships to reflect the 50-50 split. And that could be the case next year as well. But the majority leader was in fact selected by Vice President Cheney at that time and would be selected by Vice President Harris for all practical purposes next year.
Thank you. What impact do you think Purdue's no-show at the debate with Ossoff will have on the race? We got that from 2 people. They had that same question.
And I'll give the same answer to both of them. None and none. So as we talked about earlier, this is a race about turning out supporters. There's really no effort being made on either side to persuade undecided voters just because there really aren't that many. And so at this point, it's entirely possible that Ossoff could have used the debate to motivate his supporters to a greater degree, saying your incumbent senator wouldn't even bother to turn out or to come out and debate. It's also entirely possible that Perdue could use it to motivate his base. But the questions are smart ones, but they do presume a more traditional campaign environment in which there are voters undecided in the middle of the political spectrum. Because that's not the case here, the question for most Georgians isn't who to vote for, but whether to vote or not. And I don't know that Purdue's decision to skip the debate is going to have a material impact on the base of either party in that regard.
Thank you. On the topic of voter turnout, has there been analysis about whether the postcard effort to encourage voting was successful? If so, was it?
Sorry, Jessica, can you repeat that question? I lost you for just a second there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so they were asking about the postcard campaign to get people to turn out to vote. Has there been any analysis of whether that was effective or not?
The analysis of all distance campaigning, the postcard advocacy, email, text, phoning, is that the Democrats ran an unprecedentedly successful digital and remote campaign effort. What it also found is that even the most sophisticated online and remote effort still doesn't measure up to in-person campaigning. And so while Democratic volunteers, like Republican volunteers, are taking appropriate precautions, wearing masks, stepping back 6 feet after they knock on the door, both parties are now engaging much more heavily in in-person campaigning than was the case in November. But that said, even while the in-person is the most important, a remote contact, whether by postcard or by phone or by email, still is shown to have a good amount of impact. And depending on who you're sending postcards for, I'd encourage you to keep doing it because it has proven to be of benefit.
Thank you. We had two questions asking about voter suppression in Georgia. One says they have closed a bunch of polling places and are going to require ID now in an effort to suppress the Black vote and young people vote. Do you think this will just inspire these voters to turn out more, or will this disenfranchise them given that not everyone might not understand why this race is so important?
So for those of you who might not have seen this story, is one of the largest counties in Georgia, the county in which Atlanta is located, had announced a reduction in the number of polling places that they would have open on election day. And their argument was not surprisingly, they didn't say that they were trying to suppress the vote, but they said that the challenge they were having was a shortage of volunteers. Fewer and fewer people willing to spend the day at a polling place, given concerns about COVID. And as the holidays drew closer, in the resurgence of the virus, those concerns will growing greater. So a couple things have happened since then. Given the pushback, while the county officials have not agreed to reopen every one of those polling places, they've agreed to reopen some of them. Second, early voting in Georgia does start some weeks before the election, and it will start next week for the runoff. And third, it's very clear that both the state and county Democratic Party are making immense efforts to provide transportation and other types of logistical support for voters who live in other parts of the county to make sure they're able to have the opportunity to cast their ballot either early or in person on election day. So there's no way to predict, but it looks like the combination of these three factors may keep the policy change from having a discouraging impact.
Thank you. If the Republicans maintain majority in the Senate, will Biden be able to accomplish anything with healthcare, environment, or infrastructure?
Oh, I think so. And we talked about this a few weeks ago, that while certainly having a Democratic Senate would make it much easier for Biden and his administration, it is worth remembering that through 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency, whenever the White House and Congress reached a gridlock, when they reached an intractable point where they weren't able to move forward, on any number of occasions, Vice President Joe Biden and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell were able to disappear into a room, and often, if not always, to the consternation of the base of both of their parties, were able to find some type of compromise. Now, McConnell, of course, as all of you know, was on record from the first days of the Obama administration saying that his top priority was to make Obama a one-term president. But I do believe that as it relates to COVID issues, as it relates to infrastructure issues, and perhaps others, I do believe that number one, McConnell would have more of an incentive to look for opportunities to work with Biden, not on all issues, not even on most issues, but on some. And COVID and infrastructure and even some immigration policy are those that strike me as the most likely. So on one hand, McConnell has perhaps somewhat more incentive than he did 12 years ago. On the other hand, Joe Biden, by virtue for all sorts of reasons, I think has a much better understanding of the Senate and of Congress, and particularly Mitch McConnell, than newly elected President Barack Obama did. And I think Biden's many, many years in the Senate, and McConnell's almost as many years there as well, allowed them to serve at a time when even fierce partisans were occasionally able to set aside differences to work together. And so I do believe that longevity and muscle memory among these two very veteran pals does make the prospect for Biden moving at least some of his policy agenda forward. I'm more optimistic about that than many are. We'll see if I'm right.
Thank you. This will be my last question on Georgia, because I know we've been going over it a lot. Does Georgia allow absentee or mail-in ballots? If so, then we might not know the results on election night, opening up to more challenges. How long does Georgia have to certify their results?
Well, Georgia does allow mail ballots, and as I mentioned earlier, they do have early voting. I'll admit that I don't know how much time after the election they have to count them, but the questioner is exactly right, that if either of the two races are close, we might not know by January 5th or by January 6th what the balance of power in the Senate is. It is worth noting that Senator Perdue, having served 6 full years, his term expires on January 6th when the new Congress comes into office. Senator Loeffler, by virtue of having been appointed to office, her term does not automatically expire on the 6th. So as odd as it seems, if both elections require days of additional counting and ballot review, what we might have, at least for a period of time, is a 51 to 48 Senate balance, as opposed to 52-48. But it's a smart question, and Jessica, I will check on the rules in Georgia and get that information to you and Claire so that we can share it with our group.
Perfect. What do you make of the story this morning that Gavin Newsom is becoming more and more concerned about a possible recall effort against him? Is there anything to this, in fact? And where could such an effort most likely come from, and when?
So, Governor Newsom has had a rough couple of months. The most visible problem he's faced is not a substantive one, and we've talked about this in the webinar before. That back in late October, he and his wife chose to have dinner at a very, very expensive restaurant in Napa Valley called the French Laundry, with a friend of his who's a very influential lobbyist and other lobbyists as well. And many voters found that very, very hypocritical that at the same time Newsom was asking Californians to make sacrifices because of COVID, they perceived that he was not willing to live by the same guidelines that he'd offered California voters. There's all sorts of horrible scandals that have been going on all year at the state's Employment Development Department, which processes unemployment checks to Californians who've lost their jobs. And it now looks like as much as $2 billion of funds will have been sent out erroneously. Close to $1 billion potentially to prisoners, including death row inmates who illicitly filed claims, and perhaps as much of another $1 billion sent to people out of California who illicitly filed claims of their own as well. So no shortage of problems on Newsom's front. And while I still think that a recall is unlikely, it's worth going back to 2003 when Gray Davis was recalled from office. That while a group of volunteers back in 2003 were gathering signatures on petitions to recall Governor Davis, primarily because of the way they felt he mishandled the state's energy crisis in that era, it took a deep-pocketed donor to write a check to give them the funds they needed to hire paid signature gatherers to qualify the recall for the ballot. In that case, 17 years ago, It was Congressman Darrell Issa, the wealthiest member of the U.S. House of Representatives, who wrote the checks to finance the recall. And Issa, as a few of you may remember, ran in the recall election himself as a potential replacement for Davis until it became clear that he had no prospects. He dropped out of the race, and ultimately Arnold Schwarzenegger defeated Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante and others to replace Davis. But that recall wouldn't have taken place if it hadn't been for a very wealthy individual financing it. And it's very clear that the organizers of this current recall effort are looking hard for the same type of donor to finance their efforts. It's worth noting that although Newsom has run into all sorts of problems, both symbolically and substantively, the Public Policy Institute of California reported this morning that in their new poll, 58%, I believe, of Californians approve of Newsom's handling of the state's economy. It wasn't a broader job approval process. But there's no question that over the last several weeks, Newsom's behavior has cost him politically. As I've said before, it might be difficult to make an effective campaign ad about the intricacies of acquiring personal protective equipment or sending bills to the legislature instead of acting unilaterally. It's not that hard to make a pretty hard-hitting commercial criticizing the governor for going to an expensive dinner with lobbyists without wearing masks or engaging in social distancing. And so I don't think the recall is likely, but whether it's a recall election next year or Newsom's regularly scheduled re-election campaign in 2022, I do suspect he will face a more formidable challenge, either from a Republican or from another Democrat, than he might have had he chosen not to go to the dinner that night.
Thank you. And one of our audience members said that the ballots have to be in by the 5th. So she did some research for us. So thank you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. That still means that in a very close election, there's an opportunity for recounts. And in fact, if you remember from November, Georgia mandates a recount if the margin is close enough. And it also allows the losing candidate to call for a recount if it's a slightly larger margin. So we still might not know on the evening of the 5th, but at least we're not going to be waiting for quite as long. And so, Kathy, thank you very, very much for that information. And I'll feel much better if you tell Jessica that you had to look it up rather than just knowing it off the top of your head. I'm a little bit embarrassed.
Great. This questioner asks, is Dianne Feinstein on her way out?
You know, she may be. Dianne Feinstein announced about a week or so ago that she was endorsing California Secretary of State Alex Padilla to be named to Kamala Harris's Senate seat. And the question that arose immediately was, why would Feinstein be weighing in on that fight? What would she have to gain by that? Newsom is under extraordinary pressure from many places, but particularly two different types of pressure that with only one appointment are really conflicting. There's a very, very large number of Latino and Latina community leaders who are pressuring him to appoint California's first Hispanic American United States Senator. But there's an equally insistent and equally influential group of African American and female community leaders who are urging him to appoint another African American woman to replace Harris, who was the only African American woman in the Senate, or is now, and will be until she steps down from her seat. The speculation in some political circles is that Feinstein, by putting her thumb on the scale for a Latino candidate in Padilla, is essentially telling Newsom that he'll have a chance before Feinstein's term expires to appoint another senator as well. And so I think it's entirely possible that given the pressure Feinstein felt that ultimately forced her to step down from her position as the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, given a scathing article, which was just posted on the New Yorker website this morning, in which Senator Charles Schumer apparently had some very, very difficult conversations with a very confused Senator Feinstein about her place on the Judiciary Committee. I think it's entirely reasonable to think that while hopefully Senator Feinstein is healthy and will be able to serve out her term, that the odds are growing more likely that she might step down, which would give Governor Newsom the incredible opportunity to appoint not just one United States senator, but possibly two United States senators. If one of those is Alex Padilla, it would give him a chance to appoint the state's new Secretary of State. And if Javier Becerra is confirmed by the Senate as Joe Biden's new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Gavin Newsom would appoint two United States senators, a Secretary of State, and a Treasurer, and an Attorney General, all in a relatively short time period. That is completely unprecedented, and that's a lot of political chits for any governor, but particularly one who wants to shore up his flank in case of a potential recall election. Not a bad set of gifts to hand out.
Very cool. All right. Can you comment on the news about Eric Swalwell? Should he be removed from the Intelligence Committee and possibly from Congress if he is compromised?
Okay. Representative Eric Swalwell, as some of you might not have seen, was approached by U.S. intelligence agents some years ago, concerned about his relationship with a volunteer in his office, who is later identified as being an agent of China intelligence. Representative Swalwell says he has not seen or spoken to the woman in many years. He has denounced the Trump administration for leaking this investigation as a way of discrediting him, given how critical he's been of the current president. The one impact it will have is, although Swalwell was being speculated about earlier in the week before the story broke, as a potential attorney general for Newsom to name to replace Becerra, that's not going to happen, not in the middle of this. In the long term, I suspect Becerra's career will proceed just fine. Unless more information comes out, I don't think he'll be removed from the Intelligence Committee, but it's something that it's going to make it much more of a challenge for him to move up the political ladder. And the fact that he is a relatively junior member of the House of Representatives, did run briefly earlier this year for president, means he clearly has his sights set on higher office. This won't disqualify him, but it's certainly an added challenge going forward. And what this will allow me to do, Jessica, before you hand back the program to Kim, is there have been over a dozen plausible candidates being speculated about as potential replacements for Becerra as Attorney General. The two that were receiving the most attention at the beginning of the week were both members of Congress, Eric Swalwell from the Bay Area and Adam Schiff from here in the LA area. And while I'm not sure Nancy Pelosi would be all that excited about losing even temporarily a Democratic House seat until a special election could be held for Schiff's seat, it's worth noting that an option like Schiff is something that Newsom would very, very seriously consider, particularly if he were to appoint a woman and a person of color to the two Senate seats. So that's not my endorsement, but just a note that Adam Schiff might not be out of the news for all that long, but we'll see, because that's a lot on Newsom's plate, and he obviously wants to appoint not only the most qualified person, but there are considerable political implications in all four of these appointments as well.
Wow. So we've been really focusing on DC over the last few months, but it looks like we might need to pivot to Sacramento in the coming months to see what's going to change there.
Not a bad idea. I know we're going to talk about the Middle East next week, and we should probably talk next week, Jessica, about the overall COVID pandemic resurgence, and what that means, not just legislatively, but in real world and real space. But maybe either next week or in January, we should start spending a little bit more time on state government and politics. I think you're exactly right.
Sounds good. Well, we look forward to it. Kim, I will turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you, Dan.
Jessica, thanks for another terrific job on the questions. I know they come in fast and furious for Dan's, particularly his weekly programs. And we'll have a great program next week, Dan, as you alluded to. And in addition to your regular program, for our members, we have an exclusive discussion with Dan after the program. So this is a plug for, if you're not a member, this is a great incentive to become a member today. For our viewers, we are in the middle of our annual fundraising campaign, which continues through December. This campaign is so important as it helps us to raise the money that we need to cover our operating expenses to keep politics in the time of coronavirus and all our other programs going. So please text the name Schnur to the number on the screen and give what you can. We are so very appreciative of your support. Dan, thank you so much for this very rich discussion today. We can't wait until next week. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much, everybody.